Well, good evening, and welcome to episode 5 of Boys from the Baltic Star. And thank you very much for joining me. I much appreciate it. It's very kind of you. This time we're going to take a look at a few things, mostly computer related, but the reasons will become clear later. So if you've just blundered here by accident, welcome to Boys from the Baltic Star. Whether or not you're seeing us live or on catch up, the as a group, what we do is we stream largely tabletop RPG based content. I say largely because it's a fairly tenuous link that we use to talk about anything that interests us, to play games that interest us, to be part of things that interest us. So this series, Behind the Screens, is my opportunity to talk about things that are of more interest to people who are creating games or running games, and hopefully you will find something of interest tonight. So what I've got for you tonight is... Oh, before I say that, I just should quickly say we play our ongoing campaign of Traveller every Friday night at 11 p.m. UK time. That's a science fiction role-playing game. And we do lots of other things as well, mainly on Thursday nights, also at 11. We do a variety of RPG-related things. Sometimes one-shots, sometimes just chatting about RPGs, whatever feels right to us at that time. This coming Thursday, we're doing the second half of our tribute to the Olympics, where we're playing a series of games that can be played with a handful of dice and some friends sitting around a table, and we've got some guests for that, and that should be fun. So that's this coming Thursday at 11. And on Friday evening, we are continuing our Traveller campaign. The Boys from the Baltic Star, so to speak, are on board the spaceship, the Seamstress, dealing with a murder and the consequences of it, while simultaneously trying to score a very high score on their latest game that they're enjoying playing, which is called Buckyball, and is essentially space cricket. So this time on Behind the Screens, we're going to take the basic campaign narrative that we started last time and begin to turn it into a functional and playable campaign for our group of imaginary players in part 2 of RPG Adventures from Scratch. And we're going to establish the main campaign structure this time, work out how the players can actually win, and all of the millions of different and inventive and catastrophic ways that they can lose. We're going to talk about the early history of Graphical Adventures, and the pivotal role played by Sierra Online, a company that deserves a great deal of love for a number of reasons. And finally, I'm going to talk about the 8-bit era of home computing and take you through some of the software emulators that I use to recreate the experience without having to spend money and time and effort on ancient hardware, which I don't have room to store anyway. Because there are a lot of old games out there that are really brilliant, role-playing and otherwise, which you can play on these emulators essentially for free. So, with all that in mind, let's begin, as they say, at the beginning. And we'll begin with... Whoop, that was a bit ambitious. Sierra Online and the rise of the graphical adventure. So I'm going to tell you a story. In previous looks at the history of how computers and RPGs have interconnected, I've talked about text adventures, which are sort of a gateway RPG narrative, and roguelikes, which are a sort of gateway combat and character development system. So this time we're going to return to text adventures and talk about those, except that these text adventures are text adventures without the text, if that makes sense. The history of these actually begins with actual text adventures. Some text adventures, in fact, a fair few of them, began to insert some graphics as the power of the microcomputer made it practical. A few of them were quite impressive, but these were still entirely text adventures. When you got to a location in the game where it said you're standing outside a dark cave, the game also showed you a picture of the entrance to the cave. It made no difference at all to the gameplay. You still had access to all the information you needed in the text, and you still entered commands in the form of words to actually play the game, to make your move. It's just that it would show you a picture. So while you played the text adventure, there were some pictures to look at. The reason for this, let's call it an intermediate stage, was because the game could likely be played on a wide range of computers. Because this is the era when there were dozens of different computer systems out there, and they were all, to some extent, incompatible with each other, though they did form families of one kind or another. So if you were lucky enough to have a Commodore 64, for example, then you had a mighty 64 kilobytes of RAM. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum was available with 48 or 16, the BBC Micro with 32 or 16. By the time people weren't really writing games for the ZX81 anymore when the graphics come along, but with the right accessory and a healthy amount of gaffer tape to hold it in place, you could even get that machine 16K. So the games for 16K machines were essentially becoming very thin on the ground. The basic text adventure was really built around the assumption that the target platform would have at least 32. But again, some people had machines with double that. So to give them a little extra, without actually changing the game in any meaningful way, they added pictures to the games. And everybody was happy. Except those with 16K machines, but progress is cruel that way. So where were we? Right, okay. Text adventures with graphics. These are not the subject of today's bit of games history. No, really, I just needed to tell you about them to differentiate them from the things I'm actually going to talk about. I think my digressions might be slowly turning into an art form, actually. No, I'm going to talk about graphical adventures, real graphical adventures. Essentially, the difference between these and text adventures is a little bit more profound than simply adding in a picture here and there. Despite this, it's generally considered that the very first graphical adventure was a game called Mystery House, written by Roberta Williams and coded by her husband Ken. The game contained graphics, but they were purely for atmosphere, and the graphics were line art, not coloured or filled in. In short, this was definitely a text adventure with graphics, with bad graphics. But in 1980, such things were unheard of, and it was extremely successful. A weird aside, actually, from the history of gaming, there were two real powerhouse text and graphic adventure shops back in those very early days, and both of them were run by couples. Ken and Roberta Williams were one of them, but the other, Adventure International, was the first to produce an old-style text adventure for microcomputers, and that was run by Scott and Alexis Adams. Anyway, back to Ken and Roberta Williams, or Sierra. Sierra Online. Sierra was at the head of the movement to eliminate the clumsy command interface of the early text adventures. The key to this revolution was a piece of hardware called the mouse. Now, a graphical adventure could display an environment, and it could provide the ability to move the character around the location, click on things of interest, learn about them, and best of all, click on the verbs that actually made sense in the context. So rather than typing every possible combination of verbs and nouns in the hope that take lamp or get lamp or grab lamp would make sense, while actually the game was waiting for break lamp. Meanwhile, unknown to the player, smash lamp, drop lamp and kill lamp would not achieve the right objective either. It had to be specifically what what they wanted you to type in. So it's true that Mystery House wasn't really a departure from text adventures, but Sierra had more to come. What was about to come, in fact, was something of a miracle. In 1983, the video game market in the United States completely collapsed. In about a year, the console market evaporated. All that was left was games companies making games for computers. In fact, industries run on investors, in part, and burned by the end of Intellivision, Coleco, Atari as a console company, and the destruction of the arcade game market, it was almost impossible for companies that were making the still successful home computer games to get any funding anyway. However, something else happened in 1983. IBM announced a new computer, the PC Junior. IBM would essentially commission, they would pitch the computer as a less expensive IBM PC, and it was intended for the home market. And the home market meant computer games. And IBM contacted Sierra and asked them to develop a new game as a launch title for the PC Junior. IBM would pay for the whole thing, paid all the development costs, but they wanted something that could show off the power of the new machine, which was a 16-bit platform. Sierra responded with a completely new type of game, a true graphical adventure. In this game, the player was represented by a sprite that was visible on screen. Every location was a fully rendered graphical environment that the player could walk through, interacting with. The game was called King's Quest. In this game, the player's character on screen could open a door, and the door would open, the player could drop something, and the thing would appear on the ground. It was a completely revolutionary experience. Sierra, cleverly, built a game engine to run the game as a set of data files. This meant they could easily and efficiently port the thing to other platforms as well, though limitations of the older platforms generally made the ports less impressive. But there was a more useful outlet for that concept of an easy port. You see, the PC Junior was a terrible failure as a computer system. IBM was forced to abandon it very quickly. But Sierra simply ported the game to the full-spec IBM PC and kept going. In the end, Sierra published a total of 8 King's Quest games. They produced a science fiction series called Space Quest, and there were 6 in that series. They also produced a procedural police adventure series called, well, inevitably, Police Quest. Eventually there were 5 in that series. Sierra also produced the Leisure Suit Larry games, which were filled with coarse humour and some challenging puzzles. And these series, though the most famous ones that Sierra made, were only a fraction of their output. I'm not going to list everything here, but I should make reference to one other Sierra series that became highly regarded, even though it wasn't very big. In 1989, Roberta Williams wrote The Colonel's Bequest, a game that starred a female protagonist called Laura Bow. It was followed up with a sequel, but sadly the Laura Bow adventures ended with only 2 entries in the series. They were perhaps less action-filled than the various Quest series, but they were old-fashioned detective stories that would have been completely familiar to a fan of Agatha Christie. Sierra, of course, wasn't the only company to make these sorts of graphical adventures, and probably the most important of their competitors was Lucasarts, as in George Lucas, as in Star Wars. Now, LucasArts made games that included Manic Mansion and Day of the Tentacle and the Monkey Island series, and a few based on spin-offs from Lucasfilm properties like Indiana Jones. Anyway, this is essentially where we've left the 8-bit world and moved into the 16-bit adventure world, and that also opens up the door for what you might call full-scale computer RPGs. But we'll save that story for next time, when all of the threads converge.